I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of a suburban nightmare that felt like it had been scripted by a daytime soap opera, but here I was. It all started innocently enough. My family's farm, nestled on the outskirts of a small, picturesque town, had been in our family for generations. Rolling fields, vibrant crops, and the gentle hum of irrigation pumps defined my daily routine. Our life was simple, predictable, and, until recently, peaceful. The trouble began when a new development sprung up along the edge of our property, a neat, cookie-cutter subdivision with manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, governed by an HOA that seemed more like a mini-government than a homeowners association. From the start, they seemed friendly, almost excessively so. They waved when they saw me, smiled through neighborhood meetings, and welcomed the new neighbors with baked goods and pamphlets about community guidelines. I didn't pay much attention. My farm had survived droughts, market crashes, and everything in between. A few suburbanites with perfect lawns couldn't touch me. Or so I thought. The first hint of trouble came during an unusually dry summer. Our irrigation system, which had reliably delivered water for decades, started sputtering. At first, I blamed the heat. The pumps were old, the pipes rusty. But then I noticed something odd. Water levels in the shared municipal supply were dropping far faster than they ever had before. And oddly, my readings suggested that water was being diverted upstream, directly toward the subdivision. I reached out to the HOA's board, assuming it was some sort of oversight. That's when I met Karen. You know the type. A woman with a self-important air, perfectly coiffed hair, and an uncanny ability to smile while making you feel like you were the problem. She was the HOA president, and she had quickly become infamous among her neighbors for issuing fines over lawn heights, mailbox paint colors, and even the angle of solar panels. When I asked about the water issue, Karen's smile didn't falter. She was smooth, polished, and practiced at diplomacy, but there was something unsettling behind her eyes, a glint of control. "We're just following the guidelines set by the community water plan," she said, in that irritatingly calm tone that suggested disagreement was both foolish and inappropriate. "Everything is fully compliant." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the next few weeks told a different story. My crops began to wilt despite my careful irrigation. The soil cracked, and our usually verdant fields turned a dusty brown. I called the town water department, only to learn that the HOA had managed to secure priority allocation, meaning their lawns and community amenities were always filled, while my farm supply had been quietly downgraded. It felt like a betrayal. A slow, creeping injustice that was both infuriating and absurd. I had lived here my entire life. I had paid taxes, maintained the land, and contributed to the community. And now, a group of strangers, led by Karen, had essentially hijacked the water that my family depended on. The first few days, I tried the polite route. I sent letters, documented the water levels, and kept meticulous logs. I had spreadsheets, photographs, and time-stamped videos of my irrigation system running dry while the HOA sprinklers glistened in the sun, soaking perfectly green grass. It was infuriating. I expected a solution, maybe a compromise, but Karen and her minions were unyielding. By mid-summer, things escalated. One morning, I arrived at the farm to find that the main valve leading to my property had been tampered with. Not broken exactly, just subtly adjusted so that the flow was drastically reduced. Whoever did it had done it professionally, leaving little evidence, but the message was clear. They were playing for keeps. I spent hours reading every HOA regulation, municipal code, and water rights law I could find. I learned terms I never cared about before: easements, riparian rights, allocation percentages. Every conversation, every phone call, every email felt like a battle in a war I hadn't asked for. Still, I refused to back down. I wasn't going to let some HOA tyrant turn my farm into a dust bowl for her perfectly trimmed lawns. I began documenting everything with the meticulous eye of someone who knew what losing meant. I filmed the empty fields, recorded the water flow at various points, and cataloged every HOA meeting notice. I even started making a map of the water system, tracing pipes, valves, and access points. It was painstaking work, but I was determined to understand exactly how they had taken control. By late summer, it had become clear that Karen was not merely indifferent, she was strategic. Her power over the HOA's water allocation wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. She had leveraged connections with the town council, attended secret meetings, and influenced policy to favor the subdivision. Every attempt I made to appeal to fairness or reason was met with the same practiced smile and rehearsed lines about community guidelines. I began to realize that conventional approaches, letters, polite calls, official complaints, would get me nowhere. And then came the breaking point. One morning, as the sun rose over our parched fields, I discovered that an entire section of my irrigation pipeline had been blocked with industrial-grade valves purchased specifically to divert water toward the subdivision's amenities. This was no accident. This was war. At that moment, I understood something crucial. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted my farm to survive, I had to change the game entirely. I couldn't fight Karen on her terms. She had the system, the rules, and the influence. But what she didn't have was the ultimate lever, the ownership of the water itself. And that's when the idea hit me. Not revenge in the petty sense, not endless lawsuits that would drag on for years. No, I would take the source of her power away. I would buy the water company, every drop of it. Every pipe, every valve, every allocation that Karen thought she controlled, and then I would control the flow. The irony of it, the poetic justice, was almost too perfect. So, I began researching the local water company, digging through financials, ownership records, and corporate filings. I discovered that it was privately owned and, surprisingly, for sale. The pieces were in place, and I realized that if I moved quickly, I could secure control before Karen even knew what was happening. The thought of finally turning the tables, of holding the power she had wielded so cruelly, filled me with a mix of anticipation and righteous fury. By the time I closed that first day's research, the outline of a plan had taken shape. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about reclaiming what was ours and making a statement so unequivocal that the HOA would never underestimate a farm owner again. The seeds of a counterattack had been sown, and there was no turning back. The next chapter of this suburban war was about to begin. I could already picture Karen, smug and certain, unaware that the battlefield had shifted beneath her feet. What she didn't know was that the water she took for granted, the resource she used to enforce her version of order, would soon be in my hands. And when that happened, everything would change. Once the idea of buying the water company took hold, it refused to let go. It followed me through the fields, through sleepless nights, and into every quiet moment where the hum of irrigation pumps used to be. What had once been background noise was now a reminder of what was being stolen from me in plain sight. I wasn't just losing water, I was losing time, money, and the legacy my family had built over generations, and Karen knew it. I started where any modern fight begins: research. Late nights were spent hunched over a laptop, surrounded by old property maps, legal documents, and financial statements pulled from obscure municipal databases. The local water company, it turned out, wasn't some massive utility conglomerate. It was a small, privately owned operation that had quietly supplied the town and surrounding rural properties for decades. Aging infrastructure, modest profits, and an ownership group that had been looking for an exit for years. That detail alone made my pulse quicken. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. The water company was vulnerable, not in a criminal sense, but in a business one. Rising maintenance costs, pressure from new developments, and constant negotiations with the town council had worn the owners down. The HOA development had been their most recent and lucrative customer, a steady stream of revenue that came with political clout and constant demands. Karen hadn't just exploited the system, she had positioned the HOA as indispensable. I learned that she attended town meetings not as a resident, but as a community representative, always armed with talking points about property values, community growth, and sustainability. She framed the farm as outdated, inefficient, and wasteful. Lawns and decorative fountains, on the other hand, were essential to neighborhood appeal. Every word was calculated, and every nod from the council was a step closer to squeezing me out. While Karen played politics, I played chess. I reached out to a business broker who specialized in small utilities. I didn't mention the HOA, I didn't mention the conflict. I framed myself as an investor interested in infrastructure and long-term stability. The broker, tired and surprisingly candid, confirmed what I had suspected. The owners were exhausted. They wanted out before the next major round of upgrades bankrupted them. Numbers started to take shape. Purchase price, debt obligations, maintenance backlogs, regulatory requirements. It was daunting, but not impossible. Years of running a farm had taught me discipline, patience, and how to think long-term. I wasn't chasing profit alone, I was chasing leverage. At the same time, the situation on the ground worsened. The HOA installed new signage along the shared access road, declaring it private community infrastructure. Suddenly, my trucks were questioned whenever they passed too close to the subdivision's water control boxes. Anonymous complaints were filed against my farm, alleging overuse, runoff violations, and even noise disturbances from my pumps. Each one required time, inspections, and explanations. Each one drained resources I couldn't afford to lose. Karen never confronted me directly anymore. Instead, she operated through systems and paperwork, smiling from a distance as bureaucratic pressure mounted. It was subtle enough to appear lawful, but relentless enough to feel suffocating. The HOA's lawns, meanwhile, grew greener by the day. Sprinklers ran in broad daylight, fountains sparkled at the community entrance, and residents posted photos online bragging about their eco-friendly water features. The hypocrisy was staggering. Behind the scenes, I accelerated my plan. I consulted attorneys specializing in water rights and utility acquisitions. Every conversation reinforced the same truth. If I owned the company, I controlled allocation within the bounds of the law, not arbitrarily, not vindictively, but fairly, transparently, and with priority given to historical usage. My farm's rights weren't just moral, they were documented, established, and legally defensible. The process, however, would not be quick. Due diligence took weeks. I toured pumping stations under the guise of an investor walkthrough, taking mental notes on infrastructure that Karen probably didn't even know existed. Old pipes, aging control systems, manual overrides. This wasn't some sleek, automated empire. It was a patchwork held together by experience and routine, and that meant it could be run better. As negotiations progressed, word began to circulate. Small towns thrive on rumors, and it didn't take long before whispers reached the HOA. I noticed Karen at a distance one afternoon, standing near the community entrance, her phone pressed to her ear, expression tight. For the first time, her confidence looked strained. The pressure ramped up almost immediately. The water department scheduled an emergency review of my farm's usage. Inspectors showed up unannounced, clipboards in hand, measuring flow rates and scrutinizing equipment that had been approved for decades. Everything passed, of course, but the message was clear. They were watching me now. What Karen didn't realize is that scrutiny worked both ways. Through public records requests, I obtained emails between HOA board members and town officials. Nothing illegal, just revealing. Language about phasing out agricultural inefficiencies and maximizing residential satisfaction. It painted a picture of a future where my farm simply didn't exist. They weren't just stealing water, they were planning my erasure. That realization hardened something in me. This was no longer a defensive move. Buying the water company wasn't just about restoring my supply, it was about stopping a pattern of entitlement that would only grow more aggressive if left unchecked. Karen and her HOA believed systems existed to serve them exclusively. They believed money and connections insulated them from consequences. They were wrong.
The deal reached its most delicate phase as summer edged towards fall. The owners wanted assurances, continuity, community stability, and minimal disruption. I promised all of it, and meant it. I wasn't there to destroy the town, I was there to restore balance. As paperwork moved toward final review, I kept my head down. No public statements, no confrontations. I let Karen believe her pressure campaign was working, let her believe the farm was weakening, struggling, nearing capitulation. In truth, everything was aligning. At the eve of signing the letter of intent, I walked the fields at dusk. The soil was dry, the plants stressed, but still alive, resilient, just like the land had always been. I realized then that this fight wasn't just about water or power, it was about respect, for history, for fairness, and for the people who built something real long before manicured lawns and HOA bylaws arrived. The next step would be irreversible. Once the acquisition became public, Karen would know exactly what I had done. The balance of power would shift overnight, and the quiet war would turn very loud, very fast. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew one thing for certain. Chapter 3 would begin with a signature, and the consequences would ripple through the entire town.
The morning I signed the papers didn't feel dramatic at first. There were no storm clouds gathering, no cinematic music swelling in the background, just a quiet conference room, a long, polished table, and a stack of documents thick enough to change the direction of an entire town. My name sat at the bottom of each page, waiting. Every signature felt heavier than the last, not because of doubt, but because of finality. When the last document was signed and notarized, the room went silent for a moment. The broker smiled, relieved. The former owners looked tired, almost grateful. Decades of responsibility were no longer theirs. With a simple handshake, the local water company, pipes, pumps, contracts and all, became mine. The moment I stepped outside, phone buzzing in my pocket, I knew the silence wouldn't last. News travels fast in small towns, but nothing moves faster than panic when power shifts unexpectedly. By the time I reached my truck, I had 3 missed calls, 2 voicemails, and a handful of emails marked urgent. None of them were from Karen yet, but her shadow was all over them. Town officials asking for clarification, contractors suddenly checking in, even a vague message from an HOA board email address asking about rumors. I ignored them all. Instead, I drove straight to the main pumping station. Seeing it as the owner, not as a visitor, changed everything. The building was unremarkable, concrete walls, metal doors, faint vibrations humming through the floor. But inside those walls was leverage, control, the same control Karen had abused without ever truly holding it. I walked the site with the operations manager, a man who had worked there longer than Karen had lived in town. He spoke carefully at first, unsure of my intentions. That hesitation faded when I told him one thing. Historical users would be protected. His shoulders visibly relaxed. The first order of business wasn't revenge, it was restoration. I authorized immediate adjustments to restore my farm's water allocation to its documented historical levels. Nothing excessive, nothing illegal, just what had always been ours before the HOA arrived with its decorative fountains and endless sprinklers. The effect was immediate. Within hours, water pressure returned to my irrigation system. Pumps ran smoothly. Lines filled completely for the first time in months. The fields drank deeply, soil darkening as life crept back in. It felt like breathing again after being held underwater. That's when Karen called. She didn't leave a voicemail. She called again an hour later. Then again. By sunset, the tone shifted. Emails began arriving, no longer vague, no longer polite. Words like concern, disruption, and legal review appeared frequently. Karen still hadn't spoken directly, but her presence was unmistakable. The HOA board demanded explanations for sudden pressure changes affecting their irrigation systems. What they meant was simple. Their excess was gone. Under the previous arrangement, the HOA had been drawing far more than allocated, hidden behind priority classifications and quiet adjustments.
Now, every valve was calibrated, every usage monitored. Their lawns were still green, but not indulgently so. Fountains ran on timers, sprinklers shut off when they were supposed to. The entitlement shock was immediate. Within days, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. Flyers went up, emails blasted residents with warnings about unfair targeting and agricultural favoritism. Karen positioned herself as the defender of community values, conveniently omitting how those values had been funded by quietly starving a farm that predated the subdivision by generations. Town officials requested a meeting. This time, I attended. The conference room felt different now. Where once I had sat as a frustrated landowner pleading for fairness, now I sat as a utility owner presenting data. Charts showed historical usage, contracts highlighted obligations, emails documented preferential treatment granted to the HOA under questionable reasoning. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just facts. Karen sat across the table, posture rigid, smile strained. For the first time, she wasn't leading the conversation. She tried to interrupt, tried to frame the issue as community harmony, but every attempt was gently redirected back to numbers and law. Her influence evaporated in real time as council members realized how exposed the situation had become. By the end of the meeting, it was clear. The water company was operating lawfully, transparently, and in alignment with long-standing rights. There would be no reversal. Karen neffed without looking at me. The retaliation began almost immediately. Complaints multiplied. The HOA hired lawyers. Social media posts painted me as a greedy farmer hoarding resources. Anonymous letters appeared in my mailbox warning of inspections, boycotts, and consequences. Even someone filed a complaint claiming my crops were an environmental hazard. None of it stuck. Every claim collapsed under scrutiny. Every accusation required evidence they didn't have. Meanwhile, my farm recovered. Crops rebounded, revenue stabilized. The contrast between reality and the HOA's narrative grew impossible to ignore. What truly rattled Karen wasn't the loss of water, it was the loss of control. She could no longer threaten, pressure, or manipulate behind closed doors. Every request now went through formal channels, recorded and reviewed. Her power thrived in ambiguity, and I had eliminated it entirely. One evening, as I reviewed usage reports, I noticed something telling. The HOA's consumption had spiked again, subtly, just enough to test boundaries. Not illegal, but suggestive. Old habits die hard. I authorized an audit. The next morning, the HOA received a formal notice. Usage discrepancies would be investigated and penalties applied if violations were confirmed. No special treatment, no quiet adjustments, just accountability. That notice broke something. Karen finally went public, calling for residents to stand against oppression. But the tone rang hollow. Residents were noticing their dues rising to cover legal fees. Lawns were no longer immaculate. The fountains no longer sparkled endlessly. And slowly, questions turned inward. Why did they need so much water in the first place? By the time autumn settled in, the narrative had shifted. The farm wasn't the villain, it was the constant. The HOA, once pristine and confident, now looked excessive and mismanaged. And Karen? She was scrambling. As I stood in the fields one evening, watching water flow steadily through the system I now controlled, I understood that this fight was far from over. Karen wasn't finished, and neither was the HOA. But the battlefield had changed permanently. Chapter 4 wouldn't be about acquisition or restoration. It would be about exposure.
By the time autumn rolled in, the air carried a crispness that matched the tension in the town. My farm was thriving again, every field irrigated, every line flowing as it should. But tranquility was still a fragile illusion. Karen and the HOA had not retreated, they had recalibrated. If the water company purchase had shifted the power, they were now desperate to reclaim influence by any means available, whether legal, social, or insidious. It started with subtle manipulations. HOA newsletters circulated, painting me as the new utility overlord.
insinuating I was monopolizing resources for personal gain. Social media posts cropped up, showcasing photos of overwatered lawns and sprinklers running at odd hours, accompanied by captions accusing me of controlling nature for profit. Even minor water pressure adjustments in distant parts of town were twisted into evidence of a vendetta. Karen's tactics were transparent, but she relied on the illusion of authority, an aura that the average resident still trusted. I realized that controlling the water supply had restored my farm, but it hadn't yet shifted public perception. Karen was still skilled at framing the narrative. She wielded optics as efficiently as she once wielded valves. My next move required more than infrastructure. It required exposure. I began compiling evidence systematically, a dossier that left no room for misinterpretation. Every email I had obtained through public records, every usage discrepancy, every preferential allocation the HOA had quietly enjoyed over the past years, it all went into a single, comprehensive file. I mapped water flow over time, demonstrating exactly how Karen had manipulated systems, diverted resources, and prioritized aesthetics over historical rights. Every chart told a story. Every document served as proof. To make the case irrefutable, I hired a professional auditor. The goal wasn't just to prove wrongdoing, it was to present it in a way that couldn't be dismissed as opinion or personal vendetta. Every anomaly was traced, documented, and backed by hard numbers. When the audit report arrived, it was both meticulous and damning. Next came the strategic step, town council exposure. Public hearings were common, but few residents attended. I knew the key was optics. I scheduled a presentation, ensuring local news would cover the session, live streams would archive the proceedings, and residents would witness the facts firsthand. For weeks I prepared, rehearsing how to display charts, highlighting timelines, and structuring the narrative around fairness, legality, and historical precedent. My goal was simple: show that Karen and the HOA had abused a system designed to serve everyone, and the transparency now demanded accountability. The hearing day arrived. Karen entered with her signature smile, clipboard in hand, exuding the calm confidence of someone certain of victory. I watched her as she took her seat. Her eyes scanned the room, scanning the familiar faces of neighbors, waiting for whispers of support. It wasn't there, not in the way she had anticipated. People looked curious, uncertain, and increasingly skeptical of the narrative she had carefully cultivated. I began my presentation. Every slide was deliberate, every figure precise. Historical water allocations, irregular spikes favoring the HOA, documents showing internal communications with council members. Each point built a chain that led unmistakably to Karen's influence. Residents murmured as graphs revealed the sheer magnitude of diverted resources. Comparisons between the farm's rightful allotment and the subdivision's consumption were startling. Karen's smile faltered. She shifted in her chair, attempting to interrupt, but procedural rules kept the floor focused on the evidence. I moved through each point methodically, leaving no gaps. The room's energy shifted. What once seemed untouchable now appeared fallible. Residents leaned forward, council members exchanged notes, and Karen's carefully maintained authority began to crumble. When the presentation concluded, the room was quiet for a beat that felt like eternity. Then, questions began, not the rehearsed friendly questions Karen had mastered, but pointed inquiries from citizens who suddenly realized they had been misled. How had allocations been determined? Why hadn't the farm been prioritized? Could similar diversions be happening elsewhere in the town? Karen stammered, attempting answers, but her logic was linear, rigid, and exposed. Her justifications collapsed under the weight of the data. Statements she had issued over the years were now juxtaposed against documented water usage patterns. Every attempt to reframe the narrative as community benefit or administrative oversight rang hollow. The town council, previously her silent ally, could no longer maintain ambiguity without risking their credibility. Over the next week, the fallout accelerated. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the findings and highlighting Karen's influence in shaping the HOA's water allocations. Residents posted screenshots, shared audits, and circulated summaries. The digital and physical world collided, creating pressure the HOA couldn't ignore. Complaints about water hoarding shifted from me to Karen. Public sentiment began swinging visibly. The once pristine HOA reputation was now marked with mistrust, and whispers of leadership change circulated through neighborhood chats and town hall meetings. Meanwhile, I maintained the farm's water flow. Every irrigation system was calibrated correctly, every allocation documented, no exaggeration, no favoritism, just lawful, fair, and transparent distribution. The contrast between order under my oversight and the chaos left by Karen's tenure spoke volumes without a single word. People could see the results directly: thriving fields, steady residential supply, and fountains running responsibly. Karen responded, predictably, with resistance. Legal threats, formal letters, and attempts to influence council decisions were swift but increasingly desperate. The tone of communications shifted from confident to defensive. I was no longer the outsider pleading for fairness. I had become the authority. Every threat required legal documentation and procedural checks. She could no longer act unilaterally, nor could she enforce unilateral policy changes without scrutiny. And yet, as the exposure campaign succeeded, I understood something essential. Karen would not simply disappear. She was relentless, meticulous, and unwilling to relinquish her perceived dominance. This meant that while the immediate battle was being won, the war for influence, perception, and local power had entered a new phase, one where vigilance, strategy, and transparency would define every move. I walked the farm at dusk, watching water flow evenly through the irrigation system. The soil was dark and moist, crops stretching towards the fading sun. The contrast between my farm's resurgence and the HOA's faltering control was visible from even a distance. This was not just a victory, it was a turning point, but it also marked the beginning of a more complex struggle. Karen had lost the battle for control of the water, but she remained a formidable opponent in the court of public opinion and local politics. Chapter 5 would escalate the confrontation, moving beyond exposure into direct consequences, as Karen's resistance collided with the reality that her era of unquestioned authority was over. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine not just water access, but the future balance of power in the town.
By early winter, the temperature had dropped, but the tension in the town had reached a fever pitch. My farm had fully recovered, irrigation systems flowing at optimal capacity, crops thriving despite the season, and water usage finally normalized across the town. Residents could see the contrast firsthand: my farm's success, orderly water management, and efficient distribution versus the HOA's scrambling attempts to maintain appearances. But Karen was far from defeated. In fact, she was mobilizing, and her tactics had begun to shift from bureaucratic manipulation to full-scale retaliation. The first signs were subtle. Notices of violations started arriving in the mail, not for the farm, which was legally compliant, but for anyone in the neighborhood who had expressed support for my management. Residents were warned of penalties if they interfered with HOA operations or criticized board decisions publicly. Anonymous letters insinuated that supporting the farm's water allocation could result in increased fees or legal scrutiny. Karen was testing the waters, trying to intimidate the town into obedience. Simultaneously, legal actions began to pile up. The HOA filed claims against me, alleging misuse of water resources, potential environmental impact, and even minor property easement violations. Every accusation was designed to be administratively burdensome rather than immediately damaging, forcing me to spend time, energy, and resources defending myself. Their legal team, hand-picked and aggressive, sought to make the fight so tedious that I might relent. But I had anticipated this. Every move they made had been countered with meticulous preparation. My lawyers had documents, contracts, and historical records organized in advance. Every accusation dissolved under scrutiny. Every procedural challenge was met with evidence-based responses.
While Karen hoped to create chaos and doubt, I had turned transparency into a weapon. The community's perception had begun to shift even more dramatically. Residents who once quietly admired the HOA's manicured appearance now began questioning the board's decisions. Social media posts highlighted my farm's thriving fields and fair water distribution. Conversations in local stores, coffee shops, and schools increasingly framed the HOA as overreaching and self-serving. Karen's influence, built over years of politicking and subtle manipulation, was eroding before her eyes. In response, Karen escalated further. She attempted to implement new water restrictions targeting agricultural users, claiming conservation and community fairness. The proposal required town council approval, and she leaned on allies she had cultivated over the years. But this time, the council members demanded data. For once, numbers and evidence, my numbers, my evidence, trumped charm and assertion. Charts showing historical allocations, overuse by HOA properties, and the proper redistribution plan were presented. Council members, once passive observers, were forced to confront the reality. Karen's actions had been self-serving, not equitable. As the council meetings progressed, tensions escalated beyond paperwork. One evening, Karen arrived at my farm property, ostensibly to inspect the main intake station. She brought a small entourage and began taking photographs, supposedly documenting compliance. I watched from the farmhouse as their group fumbled through gates and valves, their presence intrusive but harmless. I recorded everything. Every step, every motion, every attempt to manipulate the scene was documented. Karen's desperation was becoming her undoing. By openly encroaching on private property, she left herself vulnerable legally. By making dramatic, public gestures instead of focusing on subtle control, she revealed her fear. Residents began noticing the theatrics. Conversations at neighborhood meetings shifted from "why is the farmer controlling water" to "why is the HOA leadership acting like this?" Meanwhile, I used the water company strategically, not in retaliation but in accountability. Usage reports were made transparent, monthly allocations posted publicly, and discrepancies flagged immediately. The community could see in real time exactly how water was flowing. The system now functioned as a mirror, reflecting not only fairness, but exposing the HOA's previous abuses. Karen could no longer manipulate the numbers without scrutiny. The HOA responded with propaganda. Newsletters, social media posts, and private emails painted me as authoritarian, greedy, and disruptive to community harmony. Karen positioned herself as the defender of the neighborhood, framing herself as the victim of a hostile takeover. It was a predictable strategy, but by now the town had access to records, audits, and first-hand observations. The narrative no longer stuck. By midwinter, the conflict reached its apex. Karen attempted one last move, a town-wide petition calling for an investigation into my farm's water usage, implicating mismanagement, waste, and unfair advantage. The HOA organized meetings, distributed flyers, and even engaged sympathetic residents to collect signatures. The event was highly publicized, designed to shame me and rally support for her leadership. I attended, silently observing. The room was tense. Karen spoke passionately. Her words were rehearsed, her tone commanding. But the petition, the rhetoric, the spectacle, all of it began to unravel. Residents began questioning details, citing audits, historical data, and direct observations from the fields. One by one, the momentum shifted. The petition, once appearing unstoppable, faltered. People realized that the accusations were baseless, and many began openly criticizing the HOA's handling of water for years. That night, I drove through the subdivision. Sprinklers were running less frequently, fountains operated on timers, and lawns were no longer excessively watered. Signs of previous overreach were fading. Karen's aura of control had weakened visibly. The subtle fear that once gripped residents was replaced by a cautious curiosity. Many now openly supported fair distribution, acknowledging my stewardship. I understood that the battle wasn't only legal or infrastructural, it was psychological. Karen had wielded influence through perception and fear. By shifting transparency into the community's hands, I had dismantled her power base without violence or revenge. Each field, each allocation report, each audit became a weapon, turning the town into witnesses. But even in this victory, I knew vigilance was crucial. Karen was relentless. She had proven resourceful, manipulative, and stubborn. The final chapter of this war would not be quiet. It would involve confrontation, consequences, and the ultimate assertion of who controlled both perception and reality in this small town. Chapter 6 would culminate the struggle, bringing closure to Karen's machinations and establishing the new order, one where fairness, transparency, and rightful stewardship prevailed over manipulation and entitlement.
Winter had settled fully over the town, painting the farm fields and suburban lawns with frost. But beneath the quiet blanket of cold, the tension had never been higher. Karen and the HOA were no longer subtle in their attempts to regain control. After months of exposure, audits, legal challenges, and public scrutiny, desperation had replaced their previous confidence. The town had begun to see them not as leaders, but as manipulators clinging to a power they no longer wielded effectively. It began with the town council. Multiple hearings had been scheduled to address complaints and petitions submitted by the HOA. Each time, evidence dismantled their claims. Historical water usage records, audit results, and public reporting all pointed to one simple truth. Karen's administration had been prioritizing her interests and the subdivision's excess consumption over fairness. Council members, once hesitant, now voiced concerns about governance and ethics. Their tone was firm, precise, and unsympathetic. Karen's influence, which had long relied on relationships and charm, could no longer override facts. The breaking point came during a highly anticipated council session. Residents filled the room to capacity. Cameras were rolling. The air was tense, heavy with anticipation. Karen attempted her usual tactics, deflecting blame, questioning intentions, and framing herself as the guardian of community values. But every argument was met with concrete evidence. Water allocation spreadsheets, historical comparisons, and even photographic documentation of her previous overreach were presented. As the session unfolded, murmurs began to ripple through the audience. Residents leaned forward, whispering amongst themselves, connecting the dots. For years, they had trusted the HOA's authority. Now they saw the discrepancies, the manipulation, and the repeated prioritization of aesthetics over fairness. Karen's poise cracked visibly. Gestures that were once commanding now appeared desperate. Every word she spoke was dissected and contradicted by evidence that was impossible to dispute. Meanwhile, I maintained a calm presence. I didn't need to dominate the conversation or issue accusations. The transparency of the system I now controlled spoke louder than words. Each chart, each report, each allocation figure demonstrated fairness and legality. Residents could see the difference between my management and the HOA's mismanagement. There was no ambiguity. The narrative had shifted irrevocably. After hours of testimony, questions, and presentations, the council took a recess. Whispers filled the hall. Residents expressed support for accountability and fairness. Karen, meanwhile, retreated to her seat, visibly shaken. The veneer of control she had maintained for years was crumbling, exposing both her hubris and the consequences of unchecked power. In the following days, the HOA attempted last-minute maneuvers. Lawyers sent letters threatening legal action, alleging bias, overreach, and unauthorized interference with community systems. Yet these claims lacked foundation. Every document had been reviewed, every step carefully measured, and every decision fully justified. Their actions only reinforced the public perception of desperation and overreach. Residents began questioning the rationale behind the HOA's aggressive tactics, and support for Karen dwindled rapidly. By early spring, the consequences were clear. Karen's position as HOA president had become untenable. A recall vote was scheduled by the board under mounting public pressure. Residents cited mismanagement, lack of transparency, and repeated manipulation of essential resources. When the vote occurred, the outcome was decisive. Karen was removed from leadership, her influence diminished, and the HOA was forced to restructure with a focus on accountability and fairness. The town's perception had finally aligned with reality. Where once my farm had been targeted, marginalized, and accused of mismanagement, it now stood as a model of responsible stewardship. Water flowed freely and fairly through the fields, lawns were maintained proportionately, and the town witnessed firsthand the power of transparency over entitlement. The contrast between the farm and the HOA's previous excesses became a symbol of fairness restored. In the aftermath, I implemented permanent measures to safeguard the system. Allocation reports were published monthly, residents had access to usage data, oversight committees were established, ensuring that no single entity could manipulate the system unchecked. The water company, once a tool of leverage, had become a symbol of community accountability. Karen, stripped of her formal power, retreated from public view. Attempts to rally support failed. The town had seen the evidence, and the narrative could no longer be rewritten. Her era of unquestioned authority ended, replaced by a system where fairness and transparency were the foundation. Residents adapted, understanding that the rules applied equally and that the past manipulations would not be repeated. Standing in the fields one late afternoon, watching the water flow evenly through the irrigation system I now oversaw, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The farm was thriving. The town was healthier, more aware and engaged. The battles of bureaucracy, manipulation, and entitlement had been won without destroying relationships or the community. The outcome was proof that diligence, evidence, and steadfast commitment to fairness could overcome even the most entrenched authority. As the sun dipped below the horizon, glinting off water flowing through the pipes, I reflected on the journey. What had begun as a simple fight for water evolved into a lesson about power, accountability, and the consequences of unchecked influence. Karen's story ended not with triumph, but with exposure and accountability. The farm, the water, and the town had endured, and in enduring had set a precedent for fairness that would last for generations. The conflict was over. The water was flowing, the farm was thriving, and the town had learned that true leadership is measured not by control, but by integrity, transparency, and the courage to do what is right. Karen's era had ended, and a new chapter, one of fairness, responsibility, and respect for historical rights, had begun. The pipes hummed softly in the evening breeze, carrying life to every corner of the farm and town alike. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to simply watch and breathe, knowing that the battle for water, justice, and respect had been decisively won.